The first pale light spilled over a city park that had become a sanctuary for one man's routine. For more than 3 decades, Raymond Brooks had claimed this patch of grass as his own hush-filled corner of the world. He sat on a weathered bench, coffee warming his hands, eyes drifting over the sleepy street below. The birds argued in soft bursts, and a lone jogger traced a pale arc along the path. An unfamiliar stillness hung in the air, tipping the morning toward something unsettled. A young officer stepped through the entrance, every movement wrapped in a rigid formality. He scanned the spots where people usually keep to themselves and fixed his gaze on Raymond. The moment stretched, and the park's quiet threatened to fracture under a new, unfamiliar weight. Raymond glanced up, studied the badge, and offered a courteous, if cautious, smile. He had spent a lifetime listening to noises others ignored, and this was a new sound, commanding certainty aimed at him. The old soldier's posture stayed straight, though the years pressed his shoulders forward. He had risen to leadership in countless moments of pressure, but not today, not in a park. The officer introduced himself as Clark, fresh out of academy and eager for a show of control. He asked where Raymond lived and what he was doing in a public space, as if those answers could justify a stranger's suspicion. Raymond replied that he had lived nearby for more than 30 years and wasn't about to prove anything to anyone. But the officer pressed on, the words growing sharper, like ice sliding across a blade. From a bench behind them, Kelvin Williams, a retired teacher, watched with a calm, wary eye. He had learned through decades that quiet voices could tip the balance as surely as loud ones. Kelvin rose, slow and steady, and angled his body between 2 kinds of tension. He spoke with a measured kindness that did not carry fear, but did carry authority born of experience. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, turning his gaze from Raymond to the officer, with the weight of a former classroom of students behind him. Clark tried to clamp down his authority, telling Kelvin to stay out of official business. The veteran refused to retreat, insisting that public space should belong to the people who use it. The bystanders, framed in the distance, held their breath as a third figure approached. Before the scene could escalate further, a commanding voice cut through the tension. Captain James Matthews. He appeared on the gravel path, like someone who had walked through more storms than most pedestrians could imagine. He fixed Clark with a stare that settled in the officer's spine, letting the room exhale. "Stand down," the captain ordered, though his tone left room for dialogue rather than punishment. Clark reluctantly released the space between his body and the ground, his posture stiff with frustration. Raymond lowered his gaze, not surrendering, but choosing to wait for a calmer moment to speak. Kelvin stepped back, his hands open and visible, a signal that the real negotiation would come later. Matthews spoke softly, but clearly about the city's values and the need for trust to be earned. The captain's apology was quiet but sincere, directed at the man who had never asked for trouble. He explained that the department would embark on new training focused on de-escalation, cultural awareness, and public space rights. Raymond listened, the old fatigue returning in his shoulders, though his voice remained steady. He had weathered more storms than most people could imagine, and this one felt personal in a way it hadn't before. "I hope you're serious," he said, meeting Matthew's eyes with a measured calm. "Changes aren't a cure," Kelvin added, "but they're a map we can follow." The captain nodded, acknowledging the truth in that assertion and promised ongoing accountability. The trio stood a moment longer as the park sounds reassumed their usual rhythm. News of the incident traveled quickly through the town's networks, stirring conversations in coffee shops and online feeds. People who had never spoken out found themselves wondering what they could do to prevent a repeat. Raymond and Kelvin agreed to transform their uneasy moment into deliberate action that could last beyond a single morning. They began to arrange conversations with neighborhood associations, faith leaders, and youth groups who wanted a voice. The plan included a forum where residents could challenge officers and share experiences with transparency. Anita, a young mother who had been quietly listening at the edges of the crowd, offered her support. She'd never led a march, but she believed in the power of ordinary people to shape a better future. The sense that a wall could be breached grew stronger, feeding a growing resolve among the community. The days that followed saw late-night meetings, phone trees, and a chorus of voices that refused to be silenced. Kelvin helped organize a citywide rally that would bring together residents, clergy, students, and families. The chosen site was the same park, a symbol both of history and of the ongoing fight for dignity. Raymond agreed to speak, though the thought of public attention weighed on him like a stone in his pocket. Anita, inspired by the move, joined a smaller group of volunteers who coordinated logistics and outreach. A sense of momentum built as city officials signaled a willingness to listen, if not yet to radically change. The crowd began to grow, drawn by the quiet conviction of people who refused to accept being treated as outsiders. On the eve of the event, the city buzzed with a mix of skepticism and hope that something meaningful might finally happen. The morning of the rally, banners fluttered, and families arrived with blankets and warm coffee in the small, cool air. The crowd's energy snapped into focus as Anita stepped onto the makeshift stage and introduced the afternoon's purpose. When Raymond moved toward the mic, the crowd hushed, their faces turned toward the elder man who had become a symbol. He admitted the exhaustion that had followed him through decades of public life, and the audience leaned in. "I've learned long enough that peace without accountability is only a pause," he said, his voice steady. "We deserve to belong in the places we've always called home, without having to prove it every time we're seen." Applause rose, not from polite courtesy, but from the conviction that this moment might matter. The rally intensified the call for tangible steps, training, oversight, and community-led safety measures. After the cheers, city officials took their seats and listened as questions began to pour forth. Captain Matthews returned to the podium, a new gravity in his shoulders, and acknowledged the legitimacy of the concerns. He outlined a plan that included a permanent civilian oversight board with real access to records and body camera footage. The room hummed with a nervous energy as people realized promises could become processes rather than speeches. A young man asked how the board would enforce consequences when officers failed to meet standards. Matthews admitted there would be friction and that accountability would be messy, but it would be real. The crowd's mood shifted toward cautious optimism, a belief that a different path might finally be possible. Raymond and Kelvin exchanged a look, recognizing that power here lay not in rhetoric, but in sustained effort. In the weeks that followed, the forum moved into the high school auditorium, where voices from all corners of the city crowded the seats. Officials fielded questions from residents who shared stories of fear, humiliation, and relief when treated with respect. Captain Matthews stood through the night, listening more than speaking, absorbing the raw honesty of those present. The Civilian Oversight Board began its work by reviewing protocols, then proposing changes to officer training and community liaison practices. Anita gave a brief but powerful testimony about how small acts of courage could ripple into broad change. The audience recognized that this was not a one-off gesture, but a sustained program designed to rebuild trust. As the night wore on, partnerships formed between schools, faith groups, and neighborhood associations to monitor progress. When the lights finally dimmed, the participants felt the weight of a long journey ahead, but the path had finally become visible. Back in Grant Park, Raymond found himself invited to more than a bench. He became a quiet mentor to younger organizers. He listened as Anita spoke of her own fears and hopes, and her willingness to take on leadership roles grew with each conversation. The two men discovered that their decades of experience could guide rather than overshadow the work now steaming ahead. Each week brought new volunteers, new stories, and a growing sense that the city might be changing in a meaningful way. The past still haunted some of the corners. The old wounds of bias and distrust remained, but they were no longer all-powerful. The Oversight Board published quarterly reports and invited community comment, a new ritual that fed legitimacy. Raymond kept returning to his bench, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary from conflict. It felt like a front-row seat to progress. Anita finally found her voice and began speaking at rallies with a calm authority that surprised even her. Months turned into seasons, and the city's reforms settled into steady, observable changes in schools, streets, and police practice. The work was never finished, but the cadence of improvement brought a rare sense of momentum. Raymond remained a touchstone for those who had grown up hearing stories of the old days, and now saw a different reality. Kelvin preserved his role as a steady strategist, guiding new volunteers through the evolving landscape of civic reform. Anita's peers, once tentative, now stood with confidence as they organized neighborhoods and pressed for transparency. Even the most skeptical residents admitted that something had shifted, if only gradually, and that the change felt legitimate. The park itself now carried a mixed memory of tension and renewal, a reminder of what courage can catalyze. In the glow of a late sunset, the two veterans watched a city that was no longer waiting for permission to belong, but demanding it be earned. Raymond spoke with a quiet gravity about the long arc of justice that bends slowly toward truth. He reminded the younger generation that courage is not a single act, but a daily choice to show up and be counted. The movement's power rested on listening, accountability, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to cynicism. Anita learned that leadership could be gentle, persistent, and grounded in care for community welfare. The city's officials carried a renewed sense of obligation, aware that promises carry weight only when kept. The forum's notes became a blueprint for continued reform and a pledge to revisit every policy with fresh eyes. The park's morning light returned, a symbol that the city could wake into fairness and opportunity for all. And as the sun slid beyond the trees, Raymond believed the work would outlive the moment and endure for generations. The bench welcomed them again, each morning greeting them with a different rhythm and a softer horizon. A new generation of advocates stood alongside veterans, mixing youthful energy with time-tested wisdom. They knew the road ahead would be long and sometimes painful, but they walked it together. The city's heartbeat began to sync with the pace of reform, steady and unyielding. Raymond closed his eyes for a moment, grateful for the chance to be heard without fear at last. Anita looked toward the future with a practical optimism that came from hard-won experience. Kelvin's quiet faith in collective action remained unshaken, a compass for the uncertain days ahead. They remained ready to answer the next call to stand up, to speak out, and to keep belonging a lived reality for every resident. The ripple of the movement did not stop at Grant Park. It spread to schools and town halls across the region. Parents spoke of safer streets at drop-off lines, and teachers shared notes on more respectful discipline approaches. Community clinics reported increased trust in officers who volunteered to participate in outreach events. A regional coalition formed to monitor policy changes and to translate the language of reform into practical steps. Anita found herself leading volunteer teams and guiding new faces through the maze of proposals. Raymond watched with pride, knowing that his morning's discomfort had become a compass for others' courage. He reminded the younger organizers to hold on to humility, even as progress moved faster than anyone expected. The city's story shifted from a moment of confrontation to a sustained experiment in belonging. In the end, what mattered most wasn't a single speech, but the ongoing pattern of listening and accountability. The park stood as a living canvas of memory and renewal, where every morning brought a chance to choose inclusion. The town learned that dignity is not a grant handed down by authorities, but a practice earned by everyone. The officers who remained in the force learned to measure power by service rather than intimidation. The community learned that even hard-won gains required daily defense against complacency. Raymond, long since slowed by age, still rose with the sun to watch the world wake up differently. Anita, now a steady voice in city life, spoke of stewardship, not spectacle, as the true engine of change. Kelvin's quiet faith in collective action remained unshaken, a compass for the uncertain days ahead. They remained ready to answer the next call to stand up, to speak out, and to keep belonging a lived reality for every resident.